Uh, I wish I were there in person, but there you go. I also want to apologize to everybody. I'm recovering from COVID, so if at some point I'm going to be a bit short of breath, just bear with me. I'm going to, try to recover and move on. Yeah, so this is, this project is basically a follow-up on the paper that won the prize, where I was talking about how our duties to believe bear on the impermissibility, on the epistemic impermissibility of evidence resistance. And in the meantime, I broadened up a bit the project and looked around at other types of explanations of this, what is going wrong in evidence resistance. So what is going to happen today, more or less, is I'm going to look at other hypotheses that have been put forth in philosophy and outside of philosophy to explain this phenomenon, and argue that my view explains the phenomenon better, in that it accommodates, in terms of extensional adequacy, in that it accommodates all the data that we want accommodated. So here is what's going to happen today. First, I'm going to do the necessary advertisement of my ERC research project that's funding this research. Then I'm going to talk to you about one hypothesis that's very popular in social psychology these days, which is that widespread cases of evidence resistance come as a result of motivated reasoning, in particular politically motivated reasoning. Then I'm going to look at a hypothesis put forth most notably in epistemology, in particular by people like Sandy Goldberg and Tim Williamson. And I'm going to, according to which this is not a failure to update evidence resistance, but rather is a failure in inquiry, in that this resistant cognizers don't have the relevant evidence, but they should have had it. I'm going to argue that doesn't work either. And finally, I'm going to put forth my hypothesis, which, if you read the article that won the Epistemologist Prize, you should be somewhat familiar to it, with it. And then I'm going to tell you how the view accommodates the data better. How much time do I have, just so I know when I need to stop? I have a section of the objection and replies at the end, and I just want to know if I have time to fit it in.
About 45 to 55.
45. Okay.
I can let you know if you want to.
That would be great. 5 minutes before, that would be fantastic. Yeah, thanks so much. All right, there we go. So the advertising bit, let me move the Zoom faces such that I can see the slides. Yeah, so I've been working on this ERC project that I started at the beginning of last year. The project is called Knowledge Lab, Knowledge for Social Epistemology. What the project does is it develops a novel methodology for approaching social epistemological issues. So the hypothesis, that the assumption that it starts with, is that both of our methodological approaches so far, where we started either with the individual responsibilities in social environments or with how the nature of the environment needs to be in order for us to acquire knowledge and justification, that both of these approaches have been problematic, and thereby my project proposes to not start with the individual, to not start with the social environment, but rather to start with what is being generated in the social epistemic interactions, i.e. with knowledge, and then look down from there to see what went well when that happens, and thereby discover epistemic norms that govern social epistemic interactions. So in a bit more detail, my project takes knowledge to be the aim of the practice of inquiry, and social epistemological interactions such as testimonies, disagreements, and so on, to be moves in this practice of inquiry, just like moving your rook is a move in the practice of chess, very roughly. So because of that, it takes the function of the social epistemic interactions to be generating knowledge, just like the function of moving the rook is ultimately to checkmate your opponent. And then it moves from there through a naturalistic account of normativity as generated by functions, just like in the case of biological traits, into figuring out what norms are governing our social epistemic interactions. So the thought is, just like the function of the heart of pumping blood can tell us something about when a heart is properly functioning and when it is malfunctioning, thereby when it does what it ought to do rather than not. Similarly, the thought is that the function of generating knowledge of the social epistemic interactions is going to tell us when these interactions are properly functioning, thereby functioning as they ought to be, and when they're not. in a nutshell, the thought is that what we're going to do is first put forth, kind of develop this methodology. We kind of done that at this stage, and then investigate what norms drop out of this knowledge generating function for various social epistemic interactions that we're interested in, such as testimony disagreements, group interactions, as well as media, consumer and media producer interactions. Now notice that, and this is going to become important a bit later on, notice that the upshot of this methodology is that social epistemic norms, or norms governing social epistemic interactions, are going to be inquiry norms, right? Because on this picture, they all drop out of the knowledge function of inquiry. So otherwise put, they're going to be zetetic norms. All right. So as I said, the work package, the first work package where the methodology was developed, that's almost done by now. So we moved on to the second work package that deals with testimony. So what this work package has already done is develop a knowledge first account of testimonial justification, which has to do with permissibility in accepting testimony from others. And it's now moved on to issues having to do with positive epistemology, i.e. with obligation in accepting testimony from others. So cases in point are cases of epistemic injustice, where we don't believe the testifier even though we should, or more politically hot these days, climate change deniers and vaccine hesitant cognizers are the kind of phenomenon that we're looking at. I'm writing a new book called Resistance to Evidence that kind of develops the account that I put forth in the article that won the prize. And just a sneak peek, what the book argues for is that the epistemic impermissibility of evidence resistance has to do with an input level cognitive malfunction. Basically, the book argues that our cognitive system is such that it should respond to epistemic stimuli from the environment, and when it doesn't do so, it's a case of cognitive malfunction. So that's the advertising bit. Let's move on to the philosophy. So unsurprisingly, the datum that we're going to be looking at, trying to accommodate in this talk, is going to be the widespread evidence resistance, right? And climate change, again, remember, climate change, deniability, and vaccine hesitancy. So one very popular hypothesis in social psychology has been developed in response to this worry, in response to the question as to what explains this datum. Dan Kahan, who's the main researcher who's associated this hypothesis, in his book says that polarization over questions of fact is a signature feature of contemporary political life. Notice that he takes it to be a particular feature of contemporary political life. He defines fact polarization as having to do with persistent polarized disagreement over facts that admit of scientific evidence. And this is correlated with results cited by Pew Research Center, whereby many Western countries appear to be experiencing deepening political polarization, including fact polarization. All right. So the thought is, in social psychology, we need to understand how and why this happens. And the hypothesis that Dan Kahan and his team put forth is that this has to do with politically motivated reasoning. In particular, their hypothesis is that we have a lot of evidence that suggests that climate change is happening, vaccines are great, but we fail to update based on this evidence because of politically motivated reasoning. So I'm going to call this the PMR hypothesis henceforth. Politically motivated reasoning is the source of persistent public conflict over policy relevant facts. Now we all know what motivated reasoning is, but just to rehearse it for the audience that's maybe less specialized, the tendency of individuals to conform assessment of factual information to some goal collateral to assessing its truth. All right, so the thought is that instead of forming beliefs based on evidence, what I do is I form beliefs based on some other things that are, congruent with some other goal of mine, right? So if forming beliefs based on evidence has to do with my goal of achieving truth, forming beliefs based on desires, for instance, has to do with my goal of achieving pleasure or something like that. So if I believe what I desire to be true, the thought is I'm going to feel better in virtue of having those beliefs. The thought is that in the case of particularly politically motivated reasoning, so not just any variety, the goal is political identity protection, right? So it's not only that I want to feel good, is that I want to feel good in my political identity, right? So the thought is that what I do, because I want to feel good in my political identity, is I'm going to reject all evidence that runs counter to the facts or the ideas, in the case of, falsehoods, the ideas that constitute my political identity, right? So if the constitutive ideas of my political identity are come in conflict with evidence that I get, I'm going to have a tendency to reject that evidence because I want to protect my political identity. To put in more scientific terms, political goal congruent factual information is selectively processed as if it had a lower evidential value than it actually has, right? So whenever I have evidence that, for instance, so I don't like guns, I think they're bad. If at any point I'm faced with any evidence that there might be something good about them, I'm going to reject them because this belief of mine that guns are bad is so important and central to my political identity. So how am I going to reject this evidence? I'm just going to assign it a lower evidential value than it actually has. So in that, as you can see, is according to this view, what I do wrong is a failure to update. So I have the evidence, but I fail to update on it, either because I give it less evidential value or because I give it no evidential value. All right. So PMRs purport to explain polarization of factual claims that have become symbols of membership in identity-defining affinity groups, right? So these incentives to form and maintain identity-congruent beliefs strongly dominates incentives to believe what is true. That's the thought. The thought is that for me, it's more important to believe the facts, the beliefs that constitute my political identity, right? It's more important for me to believe that guns are bad because that constitutes my political identity than it is to believe the truth, if it is to be the case that I'm faced with evidence that suggests that, to the contrary, guns are really good. And there's a reason why I keep giving the example of myself rather than the classical example of, the climate change denier, the vaccine hesitant person. And that's because according to these people, according to Dan Kahan and his team, this problem is not specific to one political side of things or the other. To the contrary, according to these guys, the problem transcends epistemic classes, in that better educated subjects are better at arguing themselves into identity affirming conclusions, so predicted to be even more evidence resistant. So the thought is, no, it is not the case, as we have assumed for the longest time, that people who, reject information about climate change and vaccines are people who, because of maybe, belonging to a social group that's less educated, are more likely to not trust scientific testimony. That's not what's going on. To the contrary, there we have a uniform explanation. We are all politically motivated cognizers. We all like our political identities. So just like the climate change denier rejects climate change facts because they want to protect their right-wing political identity, in a similar fashion, I reject any evidence that comes in that might suggest that guns are good because I want to protect my left-wing political identity. Furthermore, should I happen to be higher educated than my climate change denial counterpart, I might even be more resistant because I'm better at arguing myself out of evidence that I'm confronted with. Too bad. So now the proposed solution of this studies is fostering curiosity as an intellectual virtue. And that's because they ran some parallel studies that suggest that more curious people are likely to be less evidence resistant. Now, how is this bad news? Well, this is bad news for those of us who know a bit about intellectual virtue, because we know that that is a very hard thing to do. So, intellectual virtue tends to be a stable character trait. Developing stable character traits in people is not something that you can do overnight. So if indeed this is the only solution that we have to evidence resistance, this is pretty bad and expensive news. Fortunately, I don't believe that is what's going on. So the problem with this experiment is an epistemological problem, which is why we should use epistemologists more when we try to make assessments about quality of beliefs. The experiments, unsurprisingly, are set up that in a way that is purely descriptive and have very little in the way of normative import, because social psychologists don't know how to do normativity, just like we don't know how to do in philosophy, we don't know how to do, studies, descriptive studies, right? So that's why we should work together. The experiment is set up such that it cannot actually discriminate between motivated reasonings and epistemically justified reasonings. So all this experiment discovers is a correlation of a particular type of political identity with a particular type of tendency to reject particular evidence about some facts in that identity, but identity data is of course strongly correlated with previously held beliefs in the relevant topic. So I'm not only a left-wing academic, I'm also someone who has strong beliefs about guns being bad, and they are also justified via induction. I've traveled around Europe. We don't have guns in Europe. Turns out we have less gun violence. Traveled around the US. We have more guns in the US. Turns out we also have more gun violence in the US. So, I have these beliefs. They're justified via induction. I also have a left-wing political identity. The two come together. If you just test to see whether there's a correlation between my left-wing political identity and my tendency to reject evidence incoming suggesting that guns are good, you're not going to be able to distinguish between me rejecting this evidence because of my political identity, i.e. because of politically motivated reasoning, or just because I have previous beliefs that are very well justified by a lot of evidence that suggests that guns are bad. And if that's the case, then it is okay for me to some extent to reject incoming evidence because the evidence that I already have outweighs it. Of course, only until some point. So if at some point overwhelming evidence suggests that guns are good, I should stop rejecting it because presumably to outweigh the evidence I already have. But until that happens, this experiment is not going to tell us anything about whether what I do is politically motivated reasoning or just garden variety justified evidence weighing, right? So here's an alternative hypothesis. Rather than politically motivated reasoning, resistance to evidence may sometimes just be the result of proper Bayesian updating, often on justified priors. I think that that's what I'm doing. And here is why this explanation is more plausible. First of all, it's simpler, right? In that we don't need to stipulate widely spread irrationality. We can isolate very many people who have previous evidence that suggests that the incoming evidence is misleading. We can isolate these people from the assumption of widespread irrationality. That's always good because, quite frankly, any hypothesis that stipulates widespread irrationality, we should be suspicious of on grounds of, inference to the best explanation, right? So basically what we need is to make a distinction between evidence resistance, which is a bad thing, and mere justified evidence rejection, which these experiments in social psychology are not able to do. I should say that I ran quite fast through this data, and that's because I saw that Åsa Wikfors and Catherine Pagin are going to give a talk next time, and they're going to be talking to you about this material more thoroughly. Indeed, the first time I heard about this material was from a talk that they gave. So I'm not going to rest more on this topic because I'm sure that Åsa and Catherine Pagin are going to tell you all you need to know about it. So here's what I want to say. So here's some epistemological trivia. Previously held beliefs about all of this contentious matters can either be epistemically justified or unjustified, right? So if they're justified, they can be justified true, right? So I want to say that my belief about guns being bad is justified and true, right? Because of induction from many cases of gun control having excellent social results. But they can also be justified false. So there might be people who believe climate change isn't happening falsely, but justifiably, say based on testimony from otherwise strongly reliable sources that get it wrong on the subject matter at hand, but right on all other things. So imagine, a 15-year-old child in an isolated village somewhere in Texas who is in the following epistemic situation. All of his family and all of his neighbors who otherwise have been reliable his entire life never lied to him. Tell him that climate change isn't happening. He has no other source of information, no TV, no internet. I want to say that even though this person is clearly a limit case, and I don't know if there are many like that, but if these people exist, they are going to be, by very many accounts of testimonial justification, justified to believe that climate change isn't happening. Even though their belief will be false, it will be justified. Now, clearly, these are not the very people that we meet very often, but given an assumption of epistemic bubbles being more and more ubiquitous, you might actually discover that there are very many communities that evolve like this. Indeed, we're testing now here in Scotland the hypothesis that vaccine hesitancy in particular communities in Scotland is sourced in justified, albeit false beliefs that the vaccines are riskier than they actually are, generated in this kind of epistemic bubbly way within particular communities via justification from otherwise reliable testifiers who get it wrong on this particular occasion. So we're gonna, if my picture is right, we're gonna have a bunch of justified beliefs, some true, some false out there in the population. So we're not gonna get widespread irrationality, which is a good result to begin with. But we still need to know what's happening in the bad cases, because they're clearly gonna be bad cases, right? So we need an account of what is going epistemically wrong in the cases of unjustified beliefs. And for those of you who read my article, these are going to be familiar cases. I'm going to run really fast through them. They're just, just for illustration. Here's a case of political negligence. Bill is a stubborn supporter of President Trump, in spite of all evidence that's readily available to him, suggesting that Trump is a bad president. Bill stubbornly refuses to believe that Trump is a bad president. This is a case of evidence resistance, problematic evidence resistance by stipulation, right? Have a case of a sexist scientist, Bill, who doesn't believe anything his female colleagues say. Now, suppose he carries out 2 experiments to test his hypothesis that P. Experiment 1 strongly supports that P. Experiment 2 strongly supports that not P. The scientist comes to suspend on P on this basis. Suppose next that a female colleague of his, Anna, discovers a serious flaw in experiment number 2, which she points out to Bill. Due to sexist bias, Bill discounts Anna's word and maintains his suspension on P. There's a case of wishful thinking. Mary is an optimist. When her partner, Dan, spends more and more evening hours at the office, she's happy that his career is going so well. When he comes home smelling like floral perfume, she thinks to herself, wow, excellent taste in fragrance. Finally, when she repeatedly sees him having coffee in town with his colleague Alice, she's glad he's making new friends. And for the final case that I'm going to look at today is the fake case of friendly detective. Dave is investigating a crime scene. Dave is extremely thorough, but at the same time, a close friend of the butler's. Dave finds conclusive evidence that the butler did it, the butler's gloves covered in blood, his fingerprints on the murder weapon, a letter written by the butler confessing to the crime, but fails to form the corresponding belief because Dave just can't get himself to believe that his friend would do such a thing. So these are the cases that we're going to be working with, right, to discover what's going on in actual cases of evidence resistance rather than mere cases of justified evidence rejection. So we want to explain what's happening in these cases. So one popular hypothesis in philosophy is that these cases are cases of failure in inquiry rather than failure in updating. So according to these philosophers, what's going on is these people don't have the relevant evidence, but they should have had it. And this should is to blame for the impermissibility of what they're doing, right? And why is that? Well, because traditionally the having relation of evidence has been conceived as co-internal in philosophy. It's amazing how we don't really agree on anything, but across the internalist-externalist divide, this assumption has traveled unchecked, in that both internalists and externalists have traditionally conceived of the having evidence relation as co-internal. The thought, I think, was always that, there's the evidence and then there's the cognizer's head, and this evidence is only had insofar as it's taken out of the environment or wherever it is and put in the cognizer's head. Insofar as that doesn't happen, the cognizer doesn't have the evidence. This is very roughly what I think went on, for decades in this literature. So just to give you a few examples, again, the assumption cuts across the externalist-internalist divide. Very externalist view, evidence as is evidence is as is knowledge by Williamson. Less externalist view, as is evidence are the facts or propositions taken up via reliable cognitive capacities. This is the Sosa view. And very internalist view, one's evidence are one's seemings, again, in the head. The prediction in all the cases that we looked at is going to have to be that the subjects don't have this evidence. So in a way, this epistemological view is strongly incompatible with the politically motivated reasoning view, because remember that view assumes that we have this evidence, but we fail to update because of politically motivated reasoning. On this traditional epistemological view, we don't have this evidence. Since we don't have this evidence, that there's a question as to what we're doing wrong, because if we don't have it, clearly the problem can't be improper updating, since updating has to do with evidence that we have, right? So it's hard to say what's going wrong in these people's cases if we don't have the evidence. So what the most popular way to go about it is to say that this is a failure in inquiry, that is evidence that one should have had, even though one doesn't, right? So the traditional way to go about it, Ernie used to believe this, I don't think he does anymore. Tom Kelly is a classic example, is the hypothesis is that this is a moral should, that in this cases, these people epistemically don't do anything wrong, as a matter of fact. They just don't have this evidence, therefore their updating is impeccable, but they do something ethically wrong, right, in that they should have had this evidence. For instance, Bill, the Trump supporter, he doesn't have this evidence, but he should have had it. That's the thought. So now I find this view just implausible intuitively, right? So I think the Trump supporter does have the evidence that Trump is a bad guy. It's not that he doesn't just because he refuses to believe it. He clearly has it, right? But it's also on theoretical grounds problematic in that, remember, we looked at 4 cases, 2 of which were wishful thinking and friendly detective. In these cases, there's nothing morally problematic going on, right? So in the case of wishful thinking, to the contrary, the wife is putting a bit too much trust in the husband's, being faithful. If the literature on, trust and friendship is right, then the wife is definitely doing something morally right by putting more trust than she should in her husband. Friendly detective, the same. So these are cases where there's nothing morally problematic. There's no sexism involved. There's no, political negligence going on, and still we want to say that what they're doing is problematic. Sandy Goldberg notably thinks that the should in evidence one should have had is social. So according to Sandy, what is going on is, in virtue of our need to cooperate, there are some social expectations about our epistemic behavior. So we should believe in ways, and we should gather evidence in ways that are such that are cooperative, right? And then when we don't do that, we, as it were, threaten the common epistemic, field or background, because we're not doing our epistemic job. But at the core of this should lies this social expectations. The problem with this view is that social expectations can be legitimate or illegitimate epistemically. So there are very many countries in which it is socially expected that one shouldn't believe women because they're taken to be cognitively inferior, or that one shouldn't believe Black people. We don't want to say that those social expectations generate any epistemic normativity, but if we have a view where social expectations ground epistemic normativity, like in Sandy Goldberg's case, it's going to be very hard to explain how some social expectations are good and some social expectations are bad, epistemically speaking, because epistemology is grounded in social normativity rather than the other way around. So that's a structural problem with this kind of explanation. I like Tim's attempts of giving an account of evidence I should have a bit better, because he is going for a purist epistemic should. So Williamson, in line with the work by Maria Lasson and Arnio, thinks that what is going on in this case is that even though these guys are strictly speaking, not having this evidence because they don't know them to be true, they are blameworthy for not doing what a good believer with good epistemic dispositions would do in their situation, right? So they don't have the evidence, but the intuition that they're doing something wrong has to do with their blameworthily not doing what a good believer would do in their situation. So the problem with this account, there are 2 problems, both for the necessity and the sufficiency direction. So the first problem is that bad epistemic dispositions are not necessary for the case to get off the ground, right? So we can just stipulate that these guys have excellent epistemic dispositions, and this is just a one-off failure. So all the cases that we looked at are just one-off failures, right? So, Bill is otherwise a fantastic epistemic agent. It's just when it comes to Trump that he loses his mind. Similarly, say that the sexist scientist is actually not a sexist. He's actually, quite an all right guy. It's just this particular female scientist that he ignores, and so on, right? So Mary, the wishful thinking wife, we can again stipulate that she has fantastic epistemic dispositions. It's just on this particular occasion that she fails because she's vulnerable about her husband and so on. So if we stipulate that they have excellent epistemic dispositions, then they are doing what someone with good epistemic dispositions would do, i.e. themselves, right? Because good epistemic dispositions need not be infallible. Indeed, it's implausible that one will have infallible epistemic dispositions. Good epistemic dispositions are just going to be reliable character traits. So if we stipulate that they're very reliable agents, and this is just a one-off failure, we lose the explanation that Tim wanted to offer. But the intuition that they're doing something wrong on this particular occasion remains, right? Another problem is that there seems to be a difference between the detective case as we described it, right, where he just can't get himself to believe what the evidence that he discovered suggests, which is that his friend the butler did it. And imagine a somewhat different detective that's just lazy. He's a bad inquirer in that he goes at the crime scene and he just very shallowly looks around, doesn't find anything, and decides that the butler didn't do it. So I want to say that there's a huge difference between these two people. One of them has all the evidence in front of him and still refuses to believe, while the other one just hasn't discovered the evidence. But both have very bad epistemic dispositions, right? That this is not the proper way to behave epistemically. And this is a difference that the evidence one should have had view is going to have trouble accommodated more generally, because it looks as though the relevant evidence is, in the case of the lazy detective, also evidence that he should have had, right? All right, so just to recap, we looked at the politically motivated reasoning hypothesis. According to that hypothesis, what's happening in cases of evidence resistance is a failure in updating, but we've seen that the details didn't work out. Then we looked into in the epistemology and how various views of evidence are going to account for what's going on. And we've seen that this guy wants to say that it's not a failure of updating, it's a failure of inquiry, a failure having to do with evidence one should have had rather than with evidence that are had, as it were. But we've seen that generates problems as well. So my hypothesis is going to be, if you want, in between the two. So I hold that it is a failure of updating, that these people have this evidence, and the way in which we have historically conceived of the having relation as having to do with the internal, bit of one's skull is a mistake. It's a theoretical mistake. People have evidence if they're lying around them. They don't need to be in one's head in order to be had. So in that, I agree with the social psychologist. But what I don't agree with the social psychologist on is that this is a failure that has to do necessarily with motivated reasoning. I think that at its core is just a rejection of facts, an unjustified rejection of facts, which can, of course, be sourced in politically motivated reasoning, but it can also be sourced in unjustified previously held beliefs, right? All right, so let's see how it goes. This material will be familiar to those of you who read the article. So again, my thought is that generating knowledge is the epistemic function of inquiry, and moves in inquiry, such as forming beliefs and asserting and so on, are going to be aimed at this function of inquiry. And they're going to be aimed either directly when it comes to forming beliefs, we just aim for them to be knowledge, or indirectly, like updating or suspending. These are going to be things that are aimed at the ultimate goal of believing knowledgeably, but indirectly, right? By withholding from believing in cases in which we can't believe knowledgeably. So my favorite view of evidence has to do with being in a position to know. So in my view, facts that I'm in a position to know and that increase the evidential probability that P is the case are going to be pieces of evidence, right? Even if I don't believe them, even if I don't internalize in any way these facts, if I'm in a position to know them and they raise my evidential probability, then they're pieces of evidence. And conversely, my account of defeaters is going to have to do with facts that I'm in a position to know and that lower the evidential probability for the relevant facts. So it's a nice symmetrical account of evidence and defeat. Now, of course, you might think, whoa, everything that I'm in a position to know is in my evidence bag, as it were. That's a lot of stuff. I'm in a position to know all kinds of 1 million things around me. There are going to be restrictions of what you're in a position to know having to do with your cognitive limitations, right? So, I'm not in a position to know what you're doing in a room next door because I cannot see through walls. So that's a type limitation. It's a type of information that I can't access because of the kind of limited creature that I am. I can't see through walls. There are also going to be quantitative limitations, right? There's very many things in my visual field right now. There are very many arithmetical truths. All of these things, I may well be in a position to know each and every one of them, but not all at the same time because I just don't have the computing capacity to hold them in the front of my mind at the same time. And there are also going to be environmental limitations, right? Laws of nature that are not going to allow me to access some facts, and social norms that are not going to allow me to access some facts. So on my view, being in a position to know runs as follows. S is in a position to know a fact F if and only if S has a cognitive process with the function of generating knowledge that can, with these particular limitations, qualitatively, quantitatively, and environmentally, easily uptake F in cognizers of S's type. So the thought is that if I have a cognitive process with a function of generating knowledge, such as perception, for instance, my perceptual processes have this function of generating knowledge. And if these processes can easily uptake this particular fact, and by easily, I mean keeping in mind these limitations that I talked about, then I'm in a position to know this fact. And it's important that these processes need not be able to do that in me. They need to be able to do it in cognizers of my type. Why is that? Well, because I don't want the auto-imply scan, right? I want the restriction on auto-imply scan because I don't want the sexist to be to come across as not being able to take up women's testimony and thereby coming out as not being in a position to know whatever the woman said. The sexist may not be able to take up women's testimony because of his bias, but the kind of cognizer that he is, a human adult cognizer, surely can take up women's testimony. So if you want, it's a question of cognitive blueprint or cognitive architecture. Is the kind of brain that you have able to take up testimony from women? Yes, it is. So it's also important at this stage to distinguish between being in a position to know and being in a position to come to know, which is a very important distinction on my view. So I'm in a position to come to know what people are doing in the room next door because I can just walk and check it out, but I'm not in a position to know it. So strictly speaking, what I'm in a position to know is the kind of stuff that my cognitive processes can take up without me doing anything right now. Right, without me having to, So if I close my eyes right now, I'm in a position to come to know that there's a computer in front of me, but not in a position to know it. Right, so that's an important distinction. As I said, on my view, functions generate norms. Right, our cognitive processes should work in a way that is reliably conducive to generating knowledge in normal conditions, just as my heart should work in a way that is reliably conducive to pumping blood in normal conditions, otherwise it's a malfunctioning heart. So thereby not taking up facts one is in a position to know on my account is going to amount to failing to take up opportunities to enhance closeness to function fulfillment, to knowledge, and thereby resistance to evidence is going to come out to be an input level cognitive malfunction, just in the way in which basically if my lungs were to be, in a room filled with oxygen, but they would not take up this oxygen. In the same way, if my cognitive system is in a room filled with evidence, but it doesn't take up this evidence, what it displays is an input level cognitive malfunction. So what does this mean? That means that on my view, being in a position to know is going to deliver disjunctive epistemic obligations, right? So there's a bunch of facts around me right now. I can take up any of them, right? So I'm in a position to know any of them, but I can't take up all of them. So in that way, I have a disjunctive epistemic obligation to take up any of the subsets of facts that I'm in a position to know. So I'm only in a position to know, say, 10 things at the same time, to take up 10 things from my environment. So there are going to be many subsets of 10 things that I can take up, but not at the same time. So I'm going to have a disjunctive obligation to take up any of these facts, right? And the question is, which of these sets is going to constitute the evidence that I have, right? Because that's what we're interested in. Those pieces of evidence that I actually have that generate this epistemic obligation to take up, that explains the problematic nature of resistance to evidence. And I want to say that the way it goes is, first, all things considered, normativity is going to deliver the focus set, right? So all things considered, normativity is going to tell me that it's not okay when there's new evidence about climate change on TV for me to focus on my Wordle and thereby come to believe that climate change is not happening, because all things considered, normativity is going to say, oh, no, you should have watch the news about climate change rather than done your work. Also, in that way, all things considered, normativity is going to decide the focus set. And as soon as the focus set is decided, epistemic normativity is going to deliver the subset of facts that are part of my body of evidence via an availability ranking. So notice what's happening now to me. All things considered, normativity has delivered my focus set, right? I'm here to give a talk. Therefore, all things considered, I should focus on giving the talk, on whatever is going on in my computer and around it, right? Now, there's only so many things that I can come to believe from this focus set, right? I can't believe everything that's happening on the screen together with everything that's happening around the screen. So the question is, which of these facts are the relevant subset that are going to constitute things that I'm in a position to know, and thereby my evidence, they're going to be ranked epistemically via availability. So some things are going to be straight right in front of me in my focus set, right? They're going to be easier to come to believe because they're lighter, more sparkly, they're more central to my visual field. And as we move away from the very central and focused part of my visual field, things are going to become less and less available. And that's what's going to deliver the set that I actually need to believe, right? Notice that this is not a pragmatic or a moral encroachment, in that other norms merely determine the all things considered focus, and it is epistemic normativity that delivers what subset in particular is part of your evidence. So the upshot of this view is that all of these guys in the cases that I mentioned are going to come out as resistance to evidence or defeat, right? Because they're all constitute tokens of a particular type of cognizer that's equipped with cognitive processes that can easily uptake the relevant facts in the senses specified, with a restriction specified, right? They are in a position to know a bunch of facts that raise or lower their evidential probability that P is the case, and they fail to take up these facts. Thereby, on my view, their cognitive processes exhibit input level malfunction in that they fail to take up opportunities to enhance closeness to knowledge. How am I doing for time?
You have about 12 minutes left.
Thanks. Excellent. So let's move on to objections and replies. In that case, I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to move on from through this. So as I keep giving my picture, as I'm trying to write a book and get it right about these things in several talks, I keep collecting, unsurprisingly, a bunch of objections and thinking about a bunch of replies to them. So I thought I'd put them on the slide because I would like, feedback on these replies as well, since they're going in the book. So the obvious problem is this view going to deliver too many epistemic obligations? So this is an objection that I got from Ernie Sosa and from Matt McGrath, but also very many other people afterwards. So here is Ernie's. Suppose you're sitting with your eyes closed. There are presumably many questions about the contents of your room right then in front of you. All you need to do is open your eyes and have a look. So you then have visual cognitive processes with the function of generating knowledge that can easily uptake these particular facts in cognizers of your type. That does not imply that those processes are then malfunctioning, nor that you are resistant to evidence. Matt McGrath says you don't want to be committed to saying that when I see a bird, but don't look closely to see what kind of bird it is and simply think that's a bird and move on, I'm being resistant to easily available evidence. So I want to say that my account deals with this quite well. First of all, as I said, there's a distinction between being in a position to know and being in a position to come to know. If I sit there with my eyes closed, as in Ernie's case, I'm in a position to come to know a bunch of things, but those are not part of my body of evidence. It's only the things that I am in a position to know that are part of my body of evidence. So if I open my eyes and then there's stuff happening in front of me, then yes, that's stuff that I'm in a position to know, and it is resistance to evidence if I don't believe it. In the case of Matt McGrath, I want to say that, again, all things considered, permissibility is going to deliver the focus set. So if I don't care about that bird, there's nothing hinging on it for me, it's perfectly fine to continue walking without going and looking closer at that bird. Here's a bit of a more technical issue. So Tim Williamson puts forth this objection before I develop my view. He considers a view like mine, and he develops this objection in 2000. Suppose that I'm in a position to know any of the propositions P1 to Pn without being in a position to know all of them. There is a limit to how many things I can attend to at once. We agree on this one. Suppose that, in fact, I know P1 and I do not know P2 to Pn. According to E equals K, my evidence includes only P1 because that's the one that I know, right? According to the critic, that's me, it includes P1 to Pn. Now let Q be a proposition which is highly probable given P1 to Pn together, but highly improbable given any proper subset of them. The rest of my evidence is irrelevant to Q. According to E equals K, Q is highly improbable on my evidence because my only evidence is P1, right? Because it's the only one that I know. According to the critic, that's me, Q is highly probable on my evidence because according to me, all of this stuff belongs to my body of evidence. Tim wants to say that E equals K gives the more plausible verdict because the high probability of Q depends on an evidence set to which as a whole I have no access. Now, I want to say, first of all, that I don't have this problem as badly as it sounds, right? Because I do have this restriction. So if I can't take up P1 to Pn, then it is not in my body of evidence, according to my view, right? It's only a subset of those things that's going to be in my body of evidence because I have these quantitative limitations built into the account, right? So remember that for me, if I don't have access to all of them, to the conjunction P1 to Pn because of my cognitive limitations, then what this delivers is a disjunctive obligation, not a conjunctive obligation. I have a disjunctive obligation to believe whatever is happening in the subsets of evidence that I could take up, but not a conjunctive one, right? And then remember this, the focus is going to be individuated by all things considered normativity and then by availability constraints. But what I want to say, I want to push back further and say that I think Tim is wrong. I think that my view delivers better sectional adequacy than E equals K. And in order to see this, maybe it's useful for people who are more cognitively limited than Tim Williamson, like for instance myself, to put some flesh on the bones of the case rather than talking a lot of P's and Q's. So here's putting some flesh on the bones. It is highly probable that John killed the victim, given that P1, John is a butler, P2, John is a very nice guy with an impeccable record, and P3, the only butler who's a very nice guy with an impeccable record, was seen stabbing the victim. So given the conjunction of all of this, it's highly probable that John killed the victim. Friendly detective is told P1, P2, and P3. Right? But he can't get himself to believe P3 because of wishful thinking and believes John didn't do it based on P1 and P2, right? So now, in this case, notice that E equals K delivers the result that that's fine, right? That friendly detective is perfectly justified to believe the butler didn't do it, even though he's been told P1, P2, and P3, just because he refuses to believe P3 based on basically motivated reasoning, right? My view disagrees and gets the intuitively right result. If friendly detective was told all three propositions, he's got evidence for all three facts, therefore he's justified to believe the butler did it. So I want to say that if we put flesh on the bones of this case, what we get is better extensional adequacy on my side. All right, here's a popular puzzle that one would think might put my view in trouble. Recall that on my view, epistemic norms are zetetic norms, so they're norms that drop out of the epistemic function of inquiry, which is to generate knowledge, right? So here's a case put forth by Jane Friedman recently that seems to suggest that a view like mine is going to get in trouble. Say, for instance, that I want to know how many windows the Chrysler building in Manhattan has. I decided the best way to figure this out is to head down there myself and do a count. To do my counting, I set up outside of Grand Central Station. Say it takes me an hour of focused work to get the count done and figure out how many windows that building has. During that hour, there are many other ways I could make epistemic gains. There is obviously a huge amount of facts around me that I can come to know. So Jane thinks, well, here's a paradigmatic norm of inquiry or zetetic norm. If one wants to figure out Q, that one wants to take the necessary means to figuring out Q. Now, I don't think this is the best formulation because, you know, zetetic norms are not going to be desire conditional. The desire conditional norms are not constitutive norms and inquiry is norm constituted. So, you know, if you also have this problem, if it already came to your mind, read it as the star downstairs suggests. If one engages into an inquiry into whether Q, then one ought to take the necessary means figuring out Q. The case works just as well with that formulation. And here's a paradigmatic epistemic norm. If one is in a position to know a proposition P, then one ought to come to know that P, which is what I just argued for, right? So she thinks that in the Chrysler building case, Zip and KP come into conflict, right? So what am I supposed to do now? Am I supposed to count the windows, which is what Zip tells me, or am I supposed to come to believe all these other facts that are happening around the Chrysler building, right? There's this man exiting Central Station in a green hat. What am I supposed to do? Count the windows or believe that there's a man in a green hat? exiting the station. Furthermore, Jane argues, and I think she's right, this case, there's nothing special about it. It generalizes to all walks of life. Every day, whenever we inquire into something, we are going to be faced by this dilemma. Should I now look into the fridge to see if there's any milk like I wanted to, or should I continue forming beliefs about what's happening in the room in front of me? Now, I want to say that I don't have this problem, and here is why. Recall that on my view, being in a position to know implies easy epistemic availability, right? So we have these constraints. So on my view, there's not going to be any normative conflict in Friedman's puzzle, and here is why. We have these quantitative limitations, right? Whereby being in a position to know any of P, Q, and R and S individually will not imply being in a position to know their conjunction, right? So if by stipulation, which is the case in the Chrysler building case, I am not in a position to know, I can't know at the same time a bunch of facts around me and the number of windows of the Chrysler building, then according to my account, I am in a position to know any of them, but not both of them together. So I'm not in a position to know the conjunction. There are 400 windows and there's a man in a green hat exiting the station, right? So basically, I am in a position to know any of the number of windows is 426 and a man in a green hat is in the station, but I'm not in a position to know that the conjunction, that there are 420 windows and there's a man in a green hat exiting the station. That's because I'm too cognitively limited to process them both at the same time. And since on my view, being in a position to know is what grounds obligations, I will not be subject to ZIP and KPB at the same time. Thereby, I will not be subject to a conjunctive obligation, but only to a disjunctive obligation. If I have no conjunctive obligation, there's no epistemic normative conflict because normative conflicts presuppose a conjunctive obligation, right? And finally, this is a question that very bright Anna Mahtani asked me when I present this paper in the past is, okay, that sounds good. It does sound like you're doing well when it comes to the Friedman puzzle, but one thing that remains is, how do I ever start inquiry permissibly, right? So now that I'm here in this room, it looks as though I'm only subject to a bunch of obligations having to do with the facts that are happening around me. But how do I ever go and check out whether there's milk in the fridge permissibly? Because according to your view, I should just continue forming beliefs about what's happening in the room. And there's no way I can take a break and look in the fridge, because as soon as I do that, I'm kind of failing on my epistemic obligations to believe what's happening in the room. And I want to say that the account accommodates that via the all things considered permissibility, which is, I think, intuitively the right result, in that I have a practical interest to figure out whether there's milk in the fridge because I'm thirsty, and that practical norm overrides the epistemic norm, which unfortunately for us epistemologists happens a lot. So now that I have this practical need for drinking something, the epistemic norm that says form a bunch of beliefs about what's happening in the room is going to be overridden, and the practical norm is going to take precedence. I'm going to go open the fridge and respect the practical norm. As soon as I do that, I'm under a new epistemic obligation, which is to form whatever beliefs I need to form depending on what's happening in the fridge. And I'm not under the epistemic obligation to form beliefs about what's happening in the room anymore, because it's too much for me. I can't do them both at the same time. So I can only be subject to a disjunctive obligation when it comes to this. Thanks. That's all.